wonderful to see you all here. My name is Eleanor Stein. I'm a member of the board. I'm going to introduce Aaron, which gives me great pleasure because he's an old friend. And then when we come back and sit down, I will also introduce Benita Law-Diao, who is also a wonderful environmental justice leader in our community. So Aaron Mair has a background as an expert on epidemiology, and he's an environmentalist, and he's the past national president of one of the nation's largest environmental organizations, the Sierra Club. He was the organization's first African-American president after holding many other leadership positions and fostering the organization's environmental justice and human rights programs, really giving birth to a whole new Sierra Club from the one you might have known in the past. He speaks around the country widely on issues of environmental justice. And we first met in the struggle to close the Answers plant, which was a waste-burning electric facility based in Arbor Hill, polluting that community and providing electricity for the Empire State Plaza Government Center. So that struggle went on for years, and Aaron really pushed it forward, and as a result, he was able to found the Arbor Hill Environmental Justice Corporation, as well as the W. Haywood Burns Environmental Education Center. And it was eventually closed. I believe it maybe has reopened, or they're considering reopening it now, and there's a fight about what fuel it should be burning, or not burning. He also was a member of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, 1998 to 2000, and the EPA has recognized his great work in cleaning up the PCBs in the Hudson River. And that's something I don't need to elaborate for all of you, I'm sure. So after leaving the state government in 2021, he joined the Adirondack Council as director of his Forever Adirondacks Policy Initiative, which was aimed at protecting the wilderness to combat climate change. And he used that position to forge strong links for that organization by bringing leaders of the Black, Puerto Rican, and Hispanic Legislative Caucus to John Brown's farm and celebrations of the Adirondacks, and really opening eyes to the ties between the Adirondacks and the freedom struggle over many generations. So I have 10 more pages of introduction of Aaron, which I will not give you. I'll let you enjoy his remarks for yourself. He's going to talk to us for a bit, and then we're going to then have a circle here, and with Benita's help, we'll open up the discussion to everybody on the critical issues of environmental justice of our time, which include the incredible attack that this administration is doing on all things justice and all things environmental, and particularly when those two things come together. So with that, join me in welcoming Aaron Mair.
First and foremost, good evening, and indeed, it's an honor to be here and chat about environmental justice. In fact, I asked my sister Eleanor, I said, well, what angle of approach? And so she gave the standard, which I often give to a lot of corporate and other academic settings, the technical, wonky side of environmental justice. But what I want to do is take the journey, but also tell the narrative. But for those, the top line, environmental justice is not Black environmentalism. It's not race-based environmentalism. It comes and is anchored in the long arc of justice and justice movements and civil rights movements that emanate from third world and people and communities of color from the founding of this nation all the way through the civil rights, labor rights, and human rights struggle. And that is not for separate treatment, but as people like one of my heroes, Paul Robeson, the equal treatment and equal protection of people under the law. I will talk a little bit about my journey into this space because it was not what I intended to do. But before I do that, I need to talk about my anchoring and my background. I grew up in the Hudson Highlands of this great state. My father arrived in the Hudson Highlands in 1949 in the wake of something called the Peekskill riots. And if any of you know about the Peekskill riots, the eminent civil rights, human rights, labor rights giant Paul Robeson was giving a concert. And he was assaulted at the first concert in the fall of 49. Within 1 week, you were brutally attacked. And let's talk about the culture and community and racism and white supremacy and just anti-working class in America. Again, this is speaking to my character and what, so a lot of folks don't, know what the weight of the character that is just thrusted into the EJ movement. But anyway, my father, after the first attack upon Robeson, Pete Seeger, and a whole bunch of residents and children, they retreated to Harlem in the fall of 49. And there was a massive organizing in Harlem, and not too many people realize Harlem at that time was one of the most radical labor movements. Black communists, black socialists, labor rights, union rights, you name it. Harlem was the rocking center of radical labor. And it fused with the various internationals, white, Jewish labor rights folks that fled the fascism in Europe that came to. But anyway, they met in Harlem, of all places, and to not only lay out what happened, but what was the next step. But in short, Paul Robeson gave a rousing, motivating speech. My father, fresh out of the military, a lot of black veterans who were entitled to the GI Bill, which would give education, housing, etc. But people like Mr. Levitt and Mr. Trump, Fred Trump that is, not only did they get the monopoly, meaning the government taxpayer funded, this is what built Fred Trump's wealth, was the ability to build government housing for veterans. So guys like my dad were denied housing, so they were amongst that mass there in Harlem. But in short, when the call went out for brothers to come up in solidarity to protect the concert, and the purpose of this concert was to raise funds for an effort that Paul Robeson was leading to the United Nations to press the claim and the mistreatment of African Americans, Hispanics, and indigenous people at the UN, laying the charge, again, the crime, the human rights crime of racism and white supremacy against blacks in particular, labor in general, and how that created a permanent underclass, and how the society, would, again, uplift and be a bulwark behind that. And again, part of that time, and we talk about McCarthy and the anti-communist movement amongst the Republican side, but on the Democratic side, you had the Klan. And so up in northern Westchester, in the Hudson Highlands where I was born and raised, you had the Democratic Party, you had a robust Ku Klux Klan in Verplank, New York, that was very active and was one of the major organizers in the first riot attack. But also with Hamilton Fish the third, his son after him would be my congressman, but intergenerational Republicans, they were on the payroll of the Nazis. And they were part of an entity called the Silver Shirts. And so the Republican Party at that time was pretty pro-fascist. And so between Republicans and Democrats, and you had Peekskill, where you had what we call a lot of the camps. And the camps were a lot of the radical organizers and labor rights organizers out of New York City, mostly Jewish. They set up camps throughout Westchester, Putnam, and Dutchess County. That's where I learned about red diaper babies and all this other cool stuff. But in short, these camps and these interconnections with the black radical movement, this was a very interesting place to grow up in. But my father came up to defend the second and the successful implementation of the concert, but the concert still was assaulted. And one of the consequences, first and foremost, the concert went off. And there's an iconic picture from the air, a helicopter took a picture of the veterans and labor leaders interlocking arms. And there was the road on Oregon Road where you saw all the white supremacists and fascists up on the road. And then you had the concert and everybody down below. But one of the things that they did learn, it's kind of amazing when you have people who have the means, the ability, and the military training to inflict upon them what they're trying to inflict upon Paul and those. And one of the people that was also there was Eugene Bullard, World War I black fighting ace, and he was beaten up by a New York State trooper at that event. So if you get a chance, look up Eugene Bullard. When you talk about heroes that people don't know or undersung, but he showed up amongst, like my father, with the vets. But that's what brought my father to Peekskill, and then he realized, my goodness, well, there's Pete Seeger up here, and there's some other progressives up here, and he ended up eventually getting his little GI Bill home and met a woman at the Montrose Veterans Administration Hospital, Margaret Elizabeth McKenzie, my mother. And the rest on my family's side was growing up in the Hudson Highlands with deep Southern culture, but also Jamaican culture, Harlem culture. So it's in fact, my household was like one that would breed comedians, right? You have a Jamaican Anglican with a Southern Baptist woman. People that love to hug versus people that you can't touch. So an interesting household, but we lived what I call the river culture. I mean, you knew where you weren't welcome, but a lot of the black veterans, World War II veterans, they were always on the Hudson fishing. One of my next door neighbors, Mr. Burns, in fact, the father of Haywood and all of them, these are people that would Haywood would go on to find the CUNY law program and become the defender of Angela Davis as well as countless other heroes. He would die while securing and drafting the Constitution of the newly liberated South African Republic and the freeing of Mandela. But just to give you a sense of the neighbors and the family and the people where I grew and what was my bed. So one of the things that came from my father, who went on to become a UAW labor shop steward at General Motors plant in Terrytown, but he was really about organizing. He said, son, no matter where you go, and this is part of that man right to fish on the Hudson fishing, and he says, no matter where you go, whatever you do, son, first and foremost, I don't want you with a blue collar job, I want you to get a white collar job. And he says, and no matter where you go and how successful, always be part of an organization. So be part of something, whether it's the NAACP, it's a church group. He wasn't a religious man, but the point is, if the church was the only vehicle that was organized, but be organized. Because one of the things that part of survival as African Americans, was the communal umbrella and shield, what brought him that shield that ultimately allowed Paul to be successful in his second concert, but again, still attacked. But at the end of the day, resistance and struggle and defending yourself, there is no shame. My father was never about the code of turning the cheek. My father was always about a man to defend the people, defend the cause, defend justice. He wasn't about an advocate of violence, but an advocate of justice. And so when we talk about what would later go on was my pursuit of justice and what landed me in a community and the fight for what would become called environmental justice. And justice then, as now, was nothing more than equal protection under the law. That's simple. That's simple. It's not black law. People get talk about civil rights as black. No. Civil rights basically gave us a foundation of rights that have made America more pluralistic and more protective of people under the law. Yes, baptized with the blood of many in general, but baptized in particular with the blood and death of Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and countless to this day blacks who face down police brutality with their heads crushed in from injustice, from extrajudicial practices and acts. So being part of organizations and associations to be protective of people, that's been the foundation which I was raised in. Academically, I went to the State University of New York, where my mentors and faculty were Walter Rodney, who wrote the famous How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I was part of the radical hard left school there, which is what attracted me there, of Emanuel Wallerstein, James Selden, Jim Petrus. I've had the honor of being in lectures with Andre Gundafrank, and when we talk about world systems theory. So I had a very deep intellectual development not only in capitalism and capitalist theory, but also understanding how that underpins the inequality and the rule of the oligarchs, which are at the root of white supremacy and racism, because they need to have a division of labor. They need to have a control over the labor and productive forces in society by sex, gender, age, race, and caste. So amongst the caste, even though you get civil rights, but you start creating what they call preferred minorities. And so they start playing the game with the Asians and the Mexicans. And so again, it was all a means of dividing up labor to make it more productive and competitive for the interest of the capitalists, but also be this tool and the stooges of the capitalists to regulate the other members of civil society and the poor. So this being the foundation and background, I went on to have my own career in the military, United States Navy, come out, ended up with a research internship at the State University of Albany, and I ended up being placed in the New York State Department of Health. I have worked over 36 years in the Bureau of Chronic Disease Evaluation and Research. My sister Benita and I both health departments, so not only do we pass each other in the hallway, but we just have kindred spirits and lots of other things. But I decided at that point whether, you get yourself a nice, cushy, middle-class career, and you just, from my background, I just did not want to go live in Clifton Park, Bethlehem, in Guilderland, not because I was antithetical to the benefits of my new class and my new rise with my education and training had brought me, but because of the other contradiction of I knew how young men and women of color, when in a white environment, how they are mistreated, and the cultural gaps and the cultural oppression and the white supremacy that then they are attacked. Because I grew up in Peekskill. Okay, I remember the first day I was called nigger. Every African-American child has that experience. They have that indelible print the first day that he or she is called nigger. They can tell you the place, the space. Mine was on the playground at Uriah Hill Elementary on the merry-go-round. Okay? Every single child of color, African-American, will point to that place and space. And I did not want that for my daughters. But also I want them to grow up to face and deal with the forces that will be coming against them. And I would be able to control that and do that by raising them in a community of color. So then my choices were Troy, Schenectady, Amsterdam, or Albany. And I ended up choosing Albany because I found a place called Arbor Hill. There was a Livingston Middle School at the top on a nature preserve called Dudley, and the Tivoli Nature Preserve. And at the bottom, there was an elementary school called Arbor Hill. I said, boy, this is great. It's a walkable place, and I can actually walk to work. So I chose it because I wanted to raise my children in a community that looked like them. At least they can, if they were to be the next level of rising generation, let them decide what they want to do. But at least for them, I wanted to raise them as Americans, truly with a black conscience and the black experience, but also the strength that and the armor that they're going to need to have as young and future adults to navigate this society. And that would prove to be true, because they ultimately ended up dealing with the same issues that I dealt with, but the difference was, unlike my mom and dad, I immediately would go to the schools whenever the incident happened and press charges, have the police come, and there's a report, and it's a hate crime report that the Regents had created at that time, and put them on record. And that would usually force the kid, or force the conversation from saying he didn't know better as freedom of speech to where now if the police are involved, they would suspend the kid, but they would at least know that if it's the Mair girls, there was going to be hell to pay. So even raising them in a black community did not still shield them from the racism and white supremacy. But the beautiful thing about raising them in Albany, it was also a center of culture. A lot of great stuff to read, give to kids. And the other piece was I was able to find a parcel of land right up at Dudley Heights between Livingston Middle School and Dudley housing projects. Found a parcel of land and built a house. And I said, this is great. My house backyard outletted on the Tivoli Preserve, so I could take my daughters out for nature walks, give them what I call that youthful Hudson Highland experience, And again, not knowing about the quality of the land or anything around me, but thinking that I could still give them a slice of that middle class experience and upbringing, but in a community that looked like them, but is also empowering. So they're there to prosper and thrive from all the extra enrichment and culturally that I could bring them, in spite of what may be taken away from through their regular interaction as students. And, you know, call it fate, call it a lot of things, you know, the cosmic, you know, whatever. But as my mother said, the Lord never puts you any place that he didn't intend you to be. That's how my mama would phrase it. And so when I built my home, when the home was complete, we had a meal outdoors. And while we were having our first barbecue, we had black snow, the snowflakes from the solid. We were wondering what this stuff, and then there was the acrid smoke. And fast forward, but long and short of it, it had immediate impacts on my daughter's health. They developed something called environmental asthma. So environmental asthma is like when something is an acute exposure, meaning that something sudden, that's not normal, usual. In this case, the acute exposure was the exposure to smoke that triggered a autoimmune and respiratory response. And there was no asthma in my family, no asthma in my wife's family. And, but also, not only were the girls getting ill, but my wife was getting ill. But the long and short of it is that we found that it was coming from a solid waste incinerator. And I just so built my house that would be in the perfect flow, in the dead center flow of the soot or the smoke that would come out of the stack of this state-of-the-art solid waste incinerator that incinerated garbage for an 8-county region of the capital region. Clifton Park, everybody burned their garbage in the heart of Arbor Hill. So the poorest community, one of the poorest communities in the capital region, was burning the garbage and waste of all the top elite, poor, rich, and upper whatever suburban communities in the capital region, in the heart of their community, so that the government apparatus for the entire state of New York could have air conditioning in the summer, heat in the winter. The governor's mansion had its power. They could have all the beautiful climate creature comforts. And by the way the stack was built, the wind would not pass over them during those, seasons. In fact, the only time it would pass over them is during the winter, where you have northerly winds. That's when winds are out in the north blowing south. But the spring through summer winds, it would carry it right over Dudley Heights and Arbor Hill. When I realized my daughters were ill, oh my goodness, I apologize. So see, this is what happens. Long and short of it, we organized. We found it was a plant. I did a community study, a community analysis as an epidemiologist. We found that my children were not the only ones that were afflicted with this. Built a data case and basically went out there. The city first, they blew us off. And I told them, I have the means, I'll sue, and it kind of like laughed. Really? But the long and short of it is we worked our way up the chain and up the trend. So I knew that I was going to have to take on the state of New York, which was my boss at that time, Mario Cuomo. In order to be able to take on a massive giant, one would have to, as my father would say, scale up. And so I sought out an organization that could help us build a movement that would basically lead to shutdown. The long and short of it is that I connected up with, there's a gentleman back there, Roger Gray. He's got a little hat over there trying to hide. But Roger was a guy who was also a co-worker in Washington Street. He connected me with the Sierra Club, our first, and we went down to New York City to meet with their state chapter meeting to get a vote on it. And I remember, we were on solid waste is the issue. Solid waste, garbage, incineration. Core mainstream environmental issue. You think of a big environmental organization like Sierra Club would jump on it, right? Wrong. The first thing I was asked, well, did you go to the NAACP? I was like, oh, my color mattered. And right there you saw a dichotomy that, my protection under the environment or within the environment, and who I could talk to my color mattered. But in short, they voted me down. And my brother Roger was ashamed, watery-eyed. We had a quiet, almost 3-hour ride back from New York City back to the capital region, and he apologized. I said, "Don't, brother." I said, "I appreciate you looking out. I appreciate you did the right thing. And I won't, I appreciate that you gave me the opportunity." Within that, the next day, he and some of the local activists from the Hudson Mohawk group of the Sierra Club actually gave our first campaign sign and the first check for $250 to begin the battle. And I was moved because a lot of times whites hide because of the embarrassment. And he, like an old abolitionist, old civil rights, old freedom rider, he just said, "Screw that. They're not like us." And so he brought the fire. And that was the foundation of that collaboration. And I told him, I says, "Well, listen, man, I'm going to take this. And I promise you, once we shut this incinerator down, and once we win, I'm going to become a member of the Sierra Club and transform it from an organization that will never turn away a community because of what they perceive us to be relative to the environment." I'm way behind, but please just indulge me really quickly. This was the foundation of when I did win. And again, this is taking on the state of New York and suing my bosses. I committed career suicide because you can imagine amongst all the fellow scientists, they did not want to be in the same room and meeting with me. The commissioner, everybody broke out in cold sweats whenever I came in the room. Long and short of it, Bobby Kennedy Jr., before he lost his damn mind with NRDC, they were part of that allies that got the NRDC to back us in our successful litigation lawsuit. And a number of things were happening. This is, the 90s, but in 1987, when we began the battle, I did not know that we were going to be part of what would become the national and international environmental justice movement. 1987, Dr. Charles Lee, Dr. Benjamin Chavis, and Vernice Miller-Travis, who was their graduate research assistant in Harlem Heights, they did the first scientific data analysis study called the Toxic Waste and Race. Now, I know my brother Bob Bullitt claims to be the father of environmental justice, but because now he's the father of environmental justice, he's like the George Washington of the movement. Well, I'm the Alexander Hamilton of the movement, damn it. And I was in the room when that shit happened, and I can say not only were we part of that study, but you already know the players and what have you. And oftentimes your scholarship tries to lift up one scholar over the other, but it was truly a grassroots, multi-ethnic, multi-people. It was called, the first summit was the People of Color Summit. And it was poor whites, poor blacks, indigenous, all of us came together. And this is what really built a very unique movement at the beginning. But we still, despite the contradictions that do happen within social movements and struggles, because it pivots around sensitivities of race, ethnicity, and oppression as it relates to the dialectic of interacting with white supremacy and the white American democracy and culture. So pushing for what would be as I say, environmental justice, defining what it is, all the preambles and protocols. The bottom line is the movement is anchored in the blood, tears, and suffering and deaths of black bodies, brown bodies, indigenous bodies, poor bodies that to this day are suffering and right now are under the boot of oppression of our national government that is seeking to dismantle all the protections, thinking that it hurts only us. Remember, toxins, pollutants, contaminants, it doesn't give a damn about our race, our gender. Anybody who's a scientist or an educator knows that your body is chronically exposed or acutely exposed. It's a biological point of contact. This is an issue about science. And when we start parsing science to advance a white supremacy agenda, as it is happening right now, the destruction of the EPA, humanity loses. Humanity loses. I apologize because I thought I had, and as you can imagine, I normally have a little bit longer, but I cannot jump into the end of the race if I did not talk about the foundation. And so you have one of the rare opportunities to hear to talk about how did a guy, and more importantly, what is the intellectual foundation? What is the ecosystem that gave rise to me as an activist. And so I give you that little bit of a kernel, and I can't wait until we have the round table. Thank you.
You had me in tears more than once, I have to say. Speaking as a red diaper baby.